Okay, welcome back to the afternoon sessions. Thank you to all you compliant folks in your seats. Really appreciate that. Now something that we've been very fortunate to feature in several of our sessions recently is to hear from Steve Waldman, who is one of the founders of Report for America and many other roles that he's played, but now is leading the Rebuild Local News Coalition in Washington and leading public policy initiatives in states all around the country. Steve has been at this work for more than a decade now. He was the author of a really important report from the FCC more than 10 years ago now, big 400-page report, I seem to recall. And we heard about it then, and we've been hearing about it since, and been making some important progress, both at the federal level and at the state level. So it's always great to hear from Steve Waldman. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Before I give the update, I want to just talk briefly about why we're even talking about public policy. And I think that we have, as a community, spent a lot of time and incredible creative energy on the first two circles, and that's as it should be. Obviously, I'm a huge believer in growing philanthropy and nonprofit news. Report for America, we put 542 reporters into the field, all of that funded by philanthropy. That has to be much, much bigger, and I'm not even necessarily arguing that public policy is more important than those other two. I don't actually think it is, but it is very important, and it is underdeveloped and under-discussed relative to the others. And as a point of historical comparison, this is not new. Public policy has been shaping the nature of media and news and local news since the beginning of the country in really profound ways. So the idea that, this is kind of an anathema to talk about the government role. We have a government role now. We've always had a government role. The question is, what is it going to be? And by the way, I'm using the term public policy, you'll notice, as opposed to government subsidies, because government subsidies is one type of public policy, but there are a lot of others that shape the nature of media. And you can see from the history of some of the bigger public policy decisions that have shaped the development of media, some are subsidies, some are not. The biggest one, the one that began it all, was the postal subsidy that gave cheap postage to newspapers in the colonial era, and for 100 years after. It was massive subsidy. It would be tens of billions of dollars in today's dollars. Decisions that were made by the Federal Communications Commission and Congress about how to set up the broadcasting system had massive consequences. They decided, for instance, to give out licenses for broadcasting locally. A lot of other countries were giving them out nationally. That had a profound impact, including on the creation of local TV news as an important type of news. They also, at a different point, decided we're going to put aside about 25% of the broadcast spectrum toward non-commercial broadcasting. Also had a massive impact, combined with the 1967 law, helped really create public radio, public TV. Now, there's also bad decisions or non-decisions of public policy that have profound impact on the development of news as well. So the fact that there has been laissez-faire antitrust enforcement for the past few decades has led us to a situation, among other things, where half of the daily newspaper circulation in America right now is owned by hedge funds or private equity firms that have tended to, diminish the quality of reporting and contribute to news deserts. The whole way that Section 230 and internet rules have been set up have had massive implications on the nature of media as well. So there has been, in the last 12 to 18 months, a real pickup in activity on public policy around local news. And Rebuild Local News Coalition, which is a coalition of about 20 to 25 national organizations, many of them here, to focus on public policy to help local news specifically. The first one is the Payroll Tax Credit. This was part of something called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, a broader bill. And as it worked its way through Congress, it ended up focusing on one piece of that bill, which was a payroll tax credit. It sounds very innocuous. It's hard to overstate what a big deal it would be if this thing was passed. $1.7 billion over 5 years, $146 million for nonprofit, $147 million for BIPOC media. I mean, it really would dwarf almost anything else that the federal government has done. It passed the House and came within 2 votes in the Senate. It got that close to something that would have been one of the biggest public policy developments in American history around local news. It's probably dead for now. There's a teeny little chance that it might pass in the lame duck session. We're still working on it, but I'm not going to get anyone's hope up just yet. The second bill that you may have heard of is something called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, the JCPA. And this is the sort of force Google and Facebook to give us money bill. And it's sort of loosely modeled after an approach taken in Australia. And there are other countries around the world that are doing it. Canada has a bill that's moving forward. And it essentially would force the platforms and media cooperatives into a baseball arbitration style system where they'd each put in a bid for, this is what Facebook ought to pay us, and Facebook says, no, this is what we ought to pay you, and an arbitrator would decide. It is not limited just to local. It also would provide money to national coverage or national media, more partisan media. And there are questions about whether or not it actually has enough guarantees that that the money would get to journalism, let alone local. Our particular coalition is actually divided on this. Some of the groups in our coalition supported it and some opposed it, so we stayed neutral. But I think there's still ways that the bill could be moved in the direction of making it more likely to help local news. That passed out of the Judiciary Committee recently with the support from Ted Cruz and other people, which kind of made it sound like it really was about to pass, but I don't think it is really about to pass. It's probably has about as much chance as the payroll tax credit. It's also, its last gasp is going to be during that lame duck session. I'd put it in roughly the same category as the other ones of something. There's a little bit of a chance, but not a huge amount. So then I'm going to talk about some areas that haven't gotten nearly as much attention, but where I think we as a community should be spending some more focus. These are other areas of public policy that don't necessarily involve subsidies in a direct way, but could really have a powerful effect on the development of local news. Antitrust is one that I mentioned. So our coalition collectively submitted a proposal and comment to the Justice Department and to the Federal Trade Commission, making the case that there needed to be an approach to antitrust that would look at the effect of newspaper consolidation on the health of the information systems of communities. And we proposed some rubrics for how they might do that. Banking regulation, that's not one we would really tend to think of as related to local news. But some of you may be familiar with something called the Community Reinvestment Act, which is an anti-redlining bill. Basically gives banks what are called CRA points for doing various good things in their community. They're supposed to invest in housing and things like that. And that was sort of reopened recently. The Biden administration said, let's take another look at that, how it's doing, how should we interpret this? So we raised our hands and said, hey, while you're doing that, small businesses that serve low and moderate income communities that are news businesses, banks should get CRA points for helping those news businesses. And they ought to be advertising in those news businesses as well. So we will see, what comes of that, but it also reminds us that the whole world of economic development funds and government financing may be an area where there's some promise. Perhaps it can dovetail with efforts like the National Trust for Local News to help turbocharge or create more possibilities for local news financing. Advertising, government advertising is a really interesting area. The kind of breakthrough on this was something that's happened in New York City, led by the CUNY Newmark School, where they got the city of New York to put half of the city government advertising into community media. And it's worked really well. I mean, it's had in some of the cases of these small weeklies, it was life-saving and was able to, I know like the Haitian Times was able to use their money to hire a Report for America person to cover healthcare in the Haitian community. So it had like very, concrete actions. This is really, when they started to succeed with this, they started getting calls from all over the country, cities and states that wanted to do something similar. And by the way, at the federal level, the federal government spends $1 billion a year on advertising. Imagine if half of that went to local news. That's $500 million a year. That's bigger than the entire budget of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting just from government advertising. Now, there are issues with this, which is I think that if it's not done well, there is a possibility for political abuse to this because it's the executive branch of these entities and they could more easily, swish things around to make it go to news outlets that they like or take away from others. So I think there's a little more kind of intellectual and policy work to be done on the safeguards part of this. But if we can nail that part of it, it's a very promising area of policy. When the payroll tax credit died the first time, it's had a few lives. We started to get calls from states saying, "Hey, if you're not going to do it in D.C., we'd like to do it here in our state." Colorado, Wisconsin, New York, New Mexico, various other states. In some cases, they just took the Local Journalism Sustainability Act and copied and pasted it and made state versions of it. But as often happens, they tweaked it in really interesting ways. So for instance, in Wisconsin, which is a very, very Republican, very conservative legislature, they took the piece of the LGSA that was a tax credit for small businesses that advertise or sponsor with local media, and they made that their bill. So it essentially was a small business tax credit. And it got endorsed by the Restaurant Association and the Bank Association. It was proposed by Republicans. It passed several committees controlled by Republicans. They even got, in the ultimate sign of seriousness and effectiveness, the support of the Tavern League, which any of you from Wisconsin will know is the most important interest group in Wisconsin. So it's a sign that like different states are taking different approaches to this. And I've talked about these different tax credit approaches, but there's other approaches. Like you've probably heard about what happened in California where they've put $25 million through the Berkeley School of Journalism for fellowships directly into newsrooms. New Mexico actually also has something like that got less attention. So that is a potential, way of going. So I think there's a huge I think we're entering in a period of great creativity on the state and local level on this. Federal Communications Commission, my old stomping grounds, there's various things that, they don't talk about this at all. Like it used to be that the FCC, this was kind of one of the things they did, was care about local news. They really don't right now. They're very focused on getting broadband out. But we think that there are things that they could be doing. For instance, when they do these spectrum auctions that net billions and billions of dollars, why don't they take the principle that was established when they were giving out broadcast licenses, where they said 25% of the broadcast licenses should go to non-commercial? Well, they should take some of that spectrum money and say a few billion of that spectrum money should go to help save local news. And that could be a way of helping to finance things. Replanting. So this was discussed on one of the earlier panels. We think that there are public policies that could help with the replanting. So what I mean by that is if you imagine, as I think Elizabeth Hansen said, there was something like 2,000 independently owned and maybe 5,000 or 6,000 newspapers that are out there that are struggling partly because of the core business laws, but partly because of their ownership, who owns them. And the idea behind replanting, this metaphor that I came up with, and my wife pointed out I don't know anything about planting and I probably should stay away from metaphors like that. But my impression from her work in the garden was that there are some plants that are struggling because the soil is toxic. And that if you take it out of that soil and put it in healthier soil and give it a different type of fertilizer, it can thrive. So that's the idea behind replanting. It's not just starting new things, it's literally taking an existing thing that, in this case, the toxic environment is their ownership structure, and taking it out of that ownership structure. So for instance, you could give a tax credit or grant to nonprofit groups that buy newspapers. As that would give incentive. It would actually, the newspapers would probably like it too. And then these are some final ideas just to kind of give you a sense of the range of different things that are going on. At various points in the last year, we floated with whoever would listen the idea of, why don't we take Newsmatch, which is a great program, but instead of having $5 million in it, let's put $300 million into it. That's something like we can't, philanthropically is hard to do, but the government could do that. And there are various other ideas related to student loan relief, tax incentives for minority ownership of TV stations. That's not a new idea, but that was an idea that worked relatively well in the 70s and 80s. Improve records access. Happy to talk about any of these. And that is it. So there's really basically, I feel like we are at the very beginning phases of a real resurgence of conversation and debate about public policy, and it's essential. It has to be a big part of our collective efforts to save local news. Thank you.